Alrighty, this fight between Xbox and PlayStation over the acquisition of Activision Blizzard, for my liking, is just getting too messy, to the stage where I want to see these companies just stop battling each other and going at each other's necks. I don't necessarily like seeing it. To me, this isn't fun, this isn't entertainment. I really like both PlayStation and Xbox. I like the different approaches that they're currently taking in the games industry. I have had fond memories playing on the console and hardware of both PlayStation and Xbox over the years, and I've really enjoyed the games that they both released as well. Like, this isn't something that gives me particularly any joy, but I still think we need to talk about it because it's been so damn topical this week. There's just been news story after news story, report after report. I could have made a video on this 2 days ago and it would have been out of date within a matter of hours. I could have made a video yesterday and it would have been out of date in a matter of hours. And I'm hoping that by the time this video goes up, there's not any more, news that's actually released. But fingers crossed there's not, because as I said, it's getting a bit messy for my liking. It's getting out of hand, but we're going to talk about it. I'm going to provide some context, summarize all the main news stories that have gone live over the past 2 or 3 days, and then talk about my thoughts. So if you enjoyed this video, please like it. I'd really appreciate it. Subscribe if you're new. But the context is, of course, Xbox, they announced their intention to acquire Activision Blizzard, but they have to jump through a bunch of regulatory hoops in order to do so. The main opponent of the deal has, of course, been PlayStation. Google has had some things to say, but really it's been PlayStation. And they said a number of things. They've said that the deal is anti-competitive, that Microsoft is trying to be a monopoly in the space, that they're trying to take away Call of Duty away from PlayStation consoles, and Xbox has fired back and said, this is not about taking Call of Duty away. Look at what we did with Minecraft. That's still available on all consoles and platforms, including yours, by the way. We're not even the biggest company in the games industry in terms of revenue. We're behind you and Apple and Tencent. And even if we were to acquire Activision Blizzard, we'd still be well behind Tencent. So that's been roughly, anyways, the arguments on both sides. And then, as I said, there's been a bunch more news come out this week that we need to talk about. So 2 days ago, the New York Times released a report which essentially has shown Microsoft tried to offer Sony yet another deal in order to try and secure its acquisition of Activision Blizzard. Previously, they went to Sony and said, look, we're going to give you Call of Duty for the next 3 years if this acquisition were to be approved. Sony said publicly that that just was not tenable. It wasn't right. So apparently behind the scenes, Xbox went back to Sony and said, all right, we'll give you a 10-year licensing deal on Call of Duty. And that's just not 10 years from when the acquisition is approved and finalized. It's 10 years after the current deal runs out, which still has a few years to go. So if they did accept, it would mean that Call of Duty would still be on PlayStation 5 and probably, well into PlayStation 6 era as well. So it would have been a long time, but even then, Sony has probably said no. They haven't commented on the matter, but you could assume that they've probably said no with everything else that they've said about the deal. While their major concern has definitely been Call of Duty, it's not all about Call of Duty in my opinion. But anyways, as I said, they didn't comment on the deal, but they specifically said that Microsoft has a history of dominating industries while claiming that gamers' choices will disappear if the deal is approved. And as I said, Xbox has been firing back, especially through Phil Spencer. He's been doing interviews left, right, and center, stressing that it is not their current plan, and they have no plans to remove or even degrade Call of Duty on PlayStation. They don't want to do that. Now, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but always keep an eye on the terminology that they use here. They have no plans to do this, which means that eventually they might have the plans to do this, right? Like, if they wanted to, down the line, make a Call of Duty game exclusive, they absolutely could have the power to do that, barring any agreements that they would, might have signed with Sony or potentially Nintendo, whoever it might be. They could make that decision. And Jim Ryan and Sony and PlayStation, they know this. They also know that Phil Spencer is not going to be at the head of Xbox forever. You saw the vastly different styles of operating these companies that Phil Spencer and Don Matrick had in the past. Completely different. It's like they're two completely different companies. What happens when another person comes in, when Phil Spencer eventually might retire or leave or whatever it might be? What happens then? That person might say, oh, we have Activision Blizzard, Call of Duty, let's make it exclusive. That could easily happen, and no one can deny that that is not a possibility, right? So that's why Sony is concerned. They're not concerned out of nothing. And because of that, they have issued, by the way, this is not me supporting Sony or Xbox, I'm just reporting the news, and then I'll talk about my thoughts. But then Sony has issued a 22-page report to the UK's Competition and Market Authority, essentially the regulator there that deals with acquisitions and mergers and says whether they should be approved or not. And they've attempted again to get this deal blocked. In that report, They said a lot of things. And again, I don't even agree with a lot of the stuff that Sony has said here, even though I do believe that they have some ground to stand on here. But they've said that users would abandon PlayStations in droves if the deal was approved, that Microsoft could raise Xbox prices. I think they're talking about hardware and software there. That independent developers would be harmed, that Microsoft would have a virtually exclusive ownership on the 18-rated shooter franchise and industry, and that post-acquisition, Xbox would essentially become the one-stop shop for all the best-selling shooter franchises on console, freeing it from any serious competitive pressure. And again, I don't necessarily agree with that because you just acquired Bungie, which has Destiny. So anyways, then they continue. Microsoft's, according to PlayStation, wants PlayStation to essentially become like Nintendo, so they would become a less close and effective competitor to Xbox. And then finally, Call of Duty is critical to PlayStation, and it's consistently topping the charts over the years. Even when in Activision's eyes, Call of Duty isn't doing well, it's still at the top of the charts always. And it would lose a huge audience share if the deal was to be approved. So they've said a lot in there. Again, I don't agree with all of this, and I'll talk about that in a second. But that's not where it ends. Apparently, it's not just the UK CMA that's getting involved, but the FTC in the US, the Federal Trade Commission, might actually get involved too. Politico reports, and by the way, all the sources are linked in the description below. You should read the articles in full. That's where I'm getting this information. Politico reports that the FTC is likely to file an antitrust lawsuit to block Microsoft's intended acquisition of Activision Blizzard, according to 3 different people familiar with the matter. Now, according to the article, the lawsuit is not guaranteed, and the 4 commissioners at the FTC have yet to actually vote on the matter, so that's still yet to occur. And they haven't even met with the lawyers for Activision Blizzard or Microsoft yet. I believe the reason for that is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that they're currently undertaking investigations of their own, and they don't want to be kind of influenced or biased by those lawyers. And once they've made their decision, that's when they come in, and whether there's a lawsuit or not, they'll progress from there. But apparently the staff at the FTC that have been reviewing the deal have been skeptical of what Microsoft and Activision Blizzard have said about the deal and why it should be approved. So apparently there's a lot of doubt there, a lot of skepticism. And apparently the FTC, as part of their investigations, have even deposed Satya Nadella, the chief executive at Microsoft, and Bobby Kotick, the head of Activision, to get as much information from them as possible. So they haven't talked to their lawyers, but they've talked to them. And if they do go ahead with the lawsuit, it could come as soon as next month. So this is like almost ready to kick off. If you trust what these sources are saying, if you trust this article from Politico, I know a few people were like, this headline is clickbait, because if you read the body of the article, it makes it seem much less likely that this lawsuit would actually come, because the title was much more definitive in that regard. The FTC is likely to file an antitrust lawsuit. The body of the article is less confident in those claims, but I still think there is something there. Clearly, there are people, sources familiar with the matter that wanted to talk to Politico about this, and that I think it actually might happen. Just based on nothing, based on my gut feeling, it looks like it could happen. So what are my thoughts, man? Like, there's a lot to digest here. I do have a bunch of notes here because I don't want to kind of get arguments wrong. I know how, heated the comment section might be in this video, so I'm going to try and be as airtight as possible and as fair as possible. I don't have a foot in any race here. I'm not a fanboy of Microsoft necessarily. I'm not a fanboy of PlayStation necessarily. I like both companies. I would like to see them both succeed and do well. And as I said, I don't like seeing them fight. So I'm going to try and be as objective as possible here. It's of course impossible to do that completely, but I'll try my best. If the FTC is actually getting involved and they're filing a lawsuit on antitrust grounds, then that could absolutely kill the deal. It is one thing for the UK CMA to get involved. It is a whole other thing for the FTC to get involved, especially because Microsoft is a US-based company. If the deal is killed there, it is killed everywhere. I actually tried to consider the scenario of the FTC approving it and some other bodies, like in Brazil, they approved it. But what happens if there's just one region that doesn't approve it? If it's the UK, is that strong enough to kill the deal? Possibly if it is the UK, but what if it's a much smaller nation? What if it's Australia? I don't know the niceties behind that. But if the FTC doesn't like the deal, then it's absolutely not happening. So it's a big deal. And if the lawsuit goes ahead, I think it could kill the deal for sure. Like, it would be a long drawn out battle over years and years and years. And I don't know whether Microsoft would stick it out to the end. Maybe they would want to take the money that they invested, or they would have invested in Activision Blizzard, and instead spend it on developing games, hiring more staff, actually acquiring smaller developers, which I think they should have done in the first place. But, that's beside the point. If this lawsuit is made, I think it will actually kill the deal. It is going to be a huge black mark as well on Microsoft. I know in the past they've had antitrust issues. Recently, they've been a bit okay in that regard, but if this goes through, it's not a good look for them, right? It's not going to be a good look in the eyes of investors who have been told this deal is happening, invest your money with us. Like that, it's a big deal. It has huge implications across the board, and I think it could kill the deal. Now, as I said before, I alluded that I don't agree with all the PlayStation's arguments on this matter. And the reason being, I'll give you a few examples. They said that Xbox could raise prices, despite them just raising the prices of PlayStation 5s in almost all territories. I think aside from the US, they did it everywhere else by like $50 roughly across all nations. So them saying that is kind of contradicting their own argument. And then them saying that Microsoft is them able to exclusively corner the 18-rated shooter space when they just acquired Bungie themselves, who of course have Destiny, right? So again, is that argument completely tenable? And then they say users would abandon PlayStation in droves if the deal was approved. And I don't believe that would happen. Sony has such a huge foothold in most countries and regions, especially outside the US. In Europe and in Japan, it's all PlayStation, right? Japan, of course, is more Nintendo, but PlayStation has the biggest foothold. They have some of the biggest exclusives out there. God of War, Last of Us. It's just insane. And even Microsoft, I think it was Phil Spencer, admitted just a day ago, they had to admit that they have more and better quality exclusives and first parties. There is no denying that. Like when Xbox admits that, you have to take that seriously. So I don't, for those reasons, agree with everything that they've said. But I want to say this. You can't be surprised that Sony is doing this. Okay, I know a few people are just against this idea that Sony is getting involved in the first place. But what else would you expect them to do? In my opinion, if they didn't fight tooth and nail against this deal being approved, they wouldn't be doing a good job. As I said before, this is for many reasons. Jim Ryan and PlayStation know that Phil Spencer's not going to be at Xbox forever. And if there's someone else new that comes in, or they decide to suddenly change their management style, all these promises that they're making about Call of Duty staying on PlayStation could go like that. And they need to secure their future. So you can't be surprised that they're doing this. If Sony were to sit back and say, nah, you know what, you can do the deal, whatever, I think they'd be doing a bad job. I'm not saying that I agree with all their arguments. I don't. I just admitted that. But no one can be surprised that they're doing this in the first place. All right. This is part of mergers and acquisitions. If a company is seriously concerned about the competition in their industry and in their field, they have every right to complain about it. So you can't be surprised, even if you don't agree with what they're actually saying and the final premise. And to be clear, before all this FTC stuff came out, I thought the deal should have been approved. I didn't believe that, Microsoft was going to be a monopoly in the space and was, being very anti-competitive with this acquisition. In some regards, I'm torn, but that's where I led, in terms of my conclusion. If you looked at Microsoft in terms of market capitalization, it's clear that they're massive. They're like third biggest in the world when it comes to market cap. But that's not the measure that we should be looking at here, per se. When it comes to mergers and acquisitions and whether a move is anti-competitive and whether it's, it's forming a monopoly, you need to look at this specific industry in question that it's about, that this merger or this acquisition is about. And here we're talking about video games. We're not talking necessarily about Microsoft's wider market cap. It's not completely relevant to the discussion here. And that's what Microsoft is saying. We're not actually the biggest player in the space. And post-acquisition, we won't be the biggest player in the space. It's like Sony is trying to argue for a more narrow definition of market and industry. They're talking about the console, the video game console space, where Xbox is absolutely one of the biggest competitors, right? But Microsoft is looking gaming more broadly, including companies like Tencent and including companies like Apple. So it's very interesting. It depends how you define industry in terms of where this could actually fall. And I personally, I do think you need to look at Microsoft's position specifically in the games industry and how much money and revenue they're making from games themselves. I think that's the more fair, measure. And if you look at them before acquisition and post-acquisition, as I said, they're not going to be the biggest. They're currently behind Apple, they're behind Sony, and they're behind Tencent. And even after the deal, they'll be well behind Tencent. It's not even close. Tencent is so far away from all these other companies that it's actually insane. So by that measure, no, Microsoft would not be a monopoly, but by Sony's measure, potentially they could be. So it depends how you look at it. And there's something that I want to say as well, that it doesn't help that Microsoft just acquired ZeniMax. I think that if this was like, ZeniMax wasn't part of the picture, that never happened. If it was Microsoft trying to go after and acquire Activision Blizzard, I don't think the FTC and the UK CMA would be as heavily concerned as they are now, right? Genuinely, I don't. But the fact that they did just acquire and successfully acquire, ZeniMax for $7.5 billion, and now they're going back to these exact same regulators and say, we're back, we're doing it again with this other $69 billion deal, whatever, $70 billion, whatever crazy amount it is. They literally, they put a target on their backs after that ZeniMax deal. They put a huge target on their backs and painted them as this company, as Sony kind of implied, that is just acquiring left, right, and center. The reality is not many acquisitions have been this big in the industry. Sony has made acquisitions. As I said, they just acquired Bungie. They've made several, acquisitions in terms of more smaller developers over the years. So it's not like they're completely innocent in this matter, but there hasn't been a deal as big as this, especially in a long time. And it doesn't help that they just acquired ZeniMax. I was always surprised by this Activision Blizzard deal, especially after the ZeniMax acquisition. I didn't think it just hit me out of nowhere. We talk about Xbox not having exclusives and a lot of first party titles, and they go after a company that they know in order to get it approved, they have to give concessions and not have exclusive titles. They're trying to say we're acquiring Activision Blizzard, but we're still going to leave Call of Duty on your platforms. And because that's the only way that we can get the deal approved. So how many exclusives are they actually getting from this? In my eyes, they would have been better off going for smaller developers, smaller publishers, and it would have been a higher likelihood that it would have been approved, and they would have actually been able to get exclusives because they wouldn't have to have made all these concessions. So it's a little bit mind-boggling to me. But as I said, I don't think they helped their case with literally pairing together two big acquisitions so closely to one another. Maybe they waited 5 years or 10 years when the landscape of the industry was a little bit different. But look, maybe the time was right with everything that was happening in Activision Blizzard, with all the lawsuits and the harassment and everything. It could have just been like perfect opportunity, and Microsoft were just in a hiring an acquisition spree, and they had a lot of investment money, and Satya Nadella is suddenly really high on gaming. Maybe Phil Spencer just saw his moment and he took it. This was the best opportunity for them to make the call, because I get how that goes. Like, someone else could head up Microsoft one day that just doesn't care about gaming. So Phil Spencer is taking every opportunity he can get now. So as you can see, I'm so torn on this. My mind is fragmented. I can see arguments on both sides legitimately. But if this deal is going for a lawsuit, it's going to get canned, in my opinion. And that's not going to be a good look for Xbox. So I've talked enough. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Ladies and gentlemen, again, hopefully my voice is cracked. I've been talking too much. Hopefully you enjoyed my insight and my thoughts. And until next time, this has been Lone. Please take care of yourselves. And would you kindly keep fighting the good fight.